Welcome to yet another edition of E-Expressions for the New Indian Express. I have with me today Rutger Bregman, a Dutch historian who created waves at Davos last year when he talked about the rich not paying their taxes and arriving at Davos in 1,500 private jets, which sort of goes against the whole idea of zero carbon footprint and many other things. I suppose we can blame the pandemic for Davos not happening this year, but I think Rutger would also be one of the major reasons why they must have decided not to congregate at Davos this year. So Rutger, thank you so much for joining us from Houten in the Netherlands. And I have with me today the book that you've just written, Humankind, A Hopeful History. And it really is something I think that the world needs right now in the midst of perhaps one of the worst crises that we in our generation have seen. So what has the reaction been, particularly at this time, to A Hopeful History?
Well, I think that many people are looking for sources of hope.
Yes.
And I mean, historians have long known that crises like these are shifting points for societies, right? So it can go in many directions now. But I do also believe that there really are some hopeful signs, right? If you would have told anyone 10 years ago that, by now, a 16-year-old Swedish girl would kickstart this huge global climate justice movement, or that we would see the biggest protests in the history of the United States, or that even a newspaper like the Financial Times, the British Financial Times, would write in April that we need to reverse the policy direction of the last 40 years and think about higher taxes on the rich, a universal basic income, a Green New Deal to really try and tackle climate change. I mean, that was unimaginable 10 years ago. So I think there's still a very long way to go. And there are good reasons to be fearful and to be anxious, but there is hope as well.
One of the things that you say is that avoid the news and you'll automatically be in a more positive frame of mind. But it's difficult to do that, isn't it, in these times especially, and the social media especially. I don't know how it is in the Netherlands, but in India, it's particularly toxic. And particularly the place where all sorts of hatreds are sort of, come front and center, whether it's caste, communalism, classism, whatever, just misogyny. So, how do you do that? How do you look at social media, which is but a slice of society,
yes,
and still feel hopeful?
Well, the first thing you have to recognize is that the news and social media are the biggest addictions, basically, of our time.
Yeah.
What is it? Around 95% of people follow the news or have a social media account. And well, if we zoom in on the news is mostly about things that go wrong, about corruption, about crises, about terrorism, about violence, about wars. So if you watch a lot of the news, then at the end of the day, you've only heard about all these exceptions. You know exactly how the world doesn't work. So I think it's good to plug out a little. Psychologists talk about the concept of mean world syndrome. This is what you get if you watch too much of the news. And social media works a little bit like that. The algorithms, they want our attention so that platform like Facebook and Twitter can sell as many ads as possible, right? Now, how do they do that? They do that with outrage. Right. They want you to be outraged all the time.
Right.
I think that both the news and social media often actually increases the distance between people.
Right.
And while historians and psychologists have long known that distance is the root of all evil, it's quite hard to hate someone who's standing in front of you, just a human being, who you can look in the eyes and who you can see blush or something like that. But it's much easier to hate someone who's just behind an anonymous social media account. So I think we've really got to try and find ways to bring people together and to have proper human face-to-face contact.
One of the other things that you talk about, and you talked about blushing, human beings have perhaps the only animals who can blush. And yet we have a world full of shameless leaders, and you talk about that conundrum. And I have to say that it's not exclusive to the US. We have a few of our own shameless leaders. How do you how does one handle that conundrum?
Well, if I would summarize the message of my book in just one sentence, it would be that most people deep down are pretty decent,
Yeah.
but power corrupts.
Yes.
So power corrupts. Power is this another quite dangerous drug that really seems to damage the brain. We know, for example, that if you put powerful people in brain scans, if we would put our political leaders, many of them at least, in a brain scanner, then we would see that the regions in their brains that are involved with feelings of empathy, they don't really work anymore. They don't light up anymore. So that is what's so dangerous about power. And human beings have actually known this for a long time. So if we study nomadic hunter-gatherer cultures, and we've been nomadic hunter-gatherers for the biggest part of our history, what these societies do is they use shame to keep those at the top in check. So shame is an incredibly important thing. Now, obviously, the problem nowadays is that we live in a society that seems to be about survival of the shameless, where we have this small group of people who can do things that most of us just can't do because we would just be so ashamed. But they can sort of use their shamelessness, and somehow in our world of news and social media and powerful media, etc., they come out on top. So that is a really indictment of our current political system.
But not just politically, also socially, perhaps. You know, we have some of the most shameless celebrities. You know, you talk about philanthropy, and you know, while you know, we in India perhaps don't have enough of it, while perhaps in the West there's too much of it and not enough talk about taxes. We in India don't have enough of it. And you know, during the pandemic, we saw terrible migrant crisis where suddenly people who were working in factories, who were working at homes, were out on the roads with nothing, no safety net, because we don't have a proper social security system. So, and yet there was this shamelessness among leaders, thought leaders, corporate leaders. So it isn't just governments that are corrupt. Corporate corruption is another major source of shamelessness as well, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. And you know, I am just an old-fashioned social democrat.
Yeah.
So that means
we don't
that
have enough of that in India.
Yeah, you know, I think a civilized society should have universal healthcare, you know, accessible for everyone, public education, you know, paid for by the state and with taxes, and a universal basic income. So a floor in the income distribution so that no one has to live in poverty. I think that all of these things are actually investments, because we have an extraordinary amount of research that shows that once you get people out of poverty, once they can, you know, go to a hospital when they really need it, actually you invest in the population and you get a return on that investment, because you get much more innovation. You have to actually spend less on healthcare in the long run, and spend less on corruption and all those kind of things. So that is sort of the model that I'm in favor of. It's an old-fashioned model. It's an old idea, social democracy. But if you really take it seriously, it has quite radical implications.
You know, when you talk about universal basic income, I have to tell you, Rutger, that last year during the general elections, this was in fact the main idea that the opposition party espoused. They talked about a universal basic income. And yet it sort of got drowned in the nationalistic fervor that we had at that point. There was a terrorist attack, and then India launched a counter-strike against Pakistan, and everything else was forgotten. What makes us not accept an idea which is so clearly so good for us, and opt for something that doesn't really benefit us in any way?
Yeah, there's so much to say about this, you know. Actually, the reason I wanted to write Humankind is because my previous book, Utopia for Realists, was about basic income, and I tried to give all the scientific evidence that it really works.
Yeah.
There's so much evidence, so many experiments that have been done that show that once you give people some venture capital to make their own choices in their lives, they actually use that money really well. They find new jobs, they start new companies, you name it. But people don't believe in it often because they have this darker view of human nature. They think, well, you can give me a basic income, that would be great. But those other people, you can't trust them with the basic income, because they'll waste it on alcohol or drugs or something like that. So at that point, I realized that I needed to dig a little bit deeper and to really talk about who we are as a species. Now, if you ask that question and you look at the latest evidence we have from archaeology and anthropology and sociology and psychology, what you arrive at is a very mixed picture, actually, a mixed view of who we are. So on the one hand, we are the friendliest species in the animal kingdom. We are able to cooperate on a scale that no other animal can, and we're really good at that. Biologists even talk about survival of the friendliest, which means that for millennia, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. But we also know, and this is what I guess played a role in India and plays such a big role in countries around the globe, is the dark side of friendliness. So friendliness can turn into groupishness or followership behavior, where you actually start doing nasty things in the name of comradeship and of loyalty to your own group. And you get this in-group, out-group dynamic. And I think that's really at the heart of so many of the crimes and atrocities and wars in human history, is that, you know, as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
And that's a terrible dynamic that you see play out in history quite often.
The other dynamic you have is when the majority feels victimized. You've had it in the US with the white backlash, and you've had it in India with the Hindu backlash as well. When the majority, which is clearly in greater numbers, feels that, you know, over centuries it has been done in by history, by the forces of history. How do you explain that?
Well, I think you just made a terrific point, is that just people find it very hard to give up their privilege.
Yeah.
Or even if they don't have to give up their privilege, they sort of tend to think in certain situations that the world is zero sum. That if someone else gets something, that they by definition have to lose something. Now, I think it's very important to keep thinking in win-win. That is again the main idea of social democracy, is that actually if we work together, if we invest in each other, we'll all be better off in the long run. Now, I think the challenge of politicians, progressive politicians around the globe, is to talk in this language, but then also make it a national project. You know, I think one of the weaknesses often of politicians on the left and progressives is that they just talk about their ideas as you know, wonky technocratic ideas that are just so clearly beneficial to all of humanity. Why don't people just don't get it?
Yeah.
But you have to speak to people on an emotional level as well, right? People feel part of their country, and you have to appeal to the better angels of their nature. I think that is the challenge. I mean, human beings are clearly not angels, right? We're not. We're capable of terrible things, and of jealousy and arrogance and violence and you name it. I like to see it in this way. We have two legs, a social leg and a selfish leg, and the question is, which leg do we train? I do believe that history teaches us that we have a preference, a natural preference for our social leg, that then we really become our best selves and we're happier and we live longer lives, but we have that other leg as well. And I think the political challenge and the challenge of our leaders, but also of ourselves in our daily lives, is to bring out the best in ourselves and each other.
And similarly, you know, when we were talking about basic income as an idea in the last elections, another big idea that the opposition floated was the whole idea of the politics of love versus the politics of hatred. And as you said, it was just dismissed as a useless, wonky, you know, completely left liberal, which in India is considered a bad word by a lot of people. Idea that doesn't work. Why would something so obviously good again be rubbished like this?
Yeah, this is what often happens, is that the people who talk about friendliness and doing well, etc., are dismissed as the do-gooders, as the naive people. And this is actually the main thing that I try to do in this book, Humankind, is to redefine what it means to be a realist. So often we equate realism with cynicism and pessimism.
Right.
But I think it's actually the other way around. We now have extraordinary evidence from so many different scientific disciplines that we have evolved to work together. And this is actually our secret superpower as a species. If you want to ask the question, why are we here? Why not the Neanderthals? Why not the bonobos or the chimpanzees? Why that we conquered the globe? Why do we build spaceships and cathedrals and pyramids and you name it? Well, for a long time, we like to believe that we are so powerful or so smart or so mean or aggressive or whatever. But that actually is not the case. Human beings are not that smart. On an individual level, If you do an intelligence test with a chimpanzee and a human toddler of around 2 years old, actually often the chimpanzee or a pig, or for that matter, often the animals win. They're actually smarter. Human beings are not that impressive on an individual level. But when we work together, when we learn from each other, when we can imitate each other, then we start building culture, then we start building civilization and learning things. That is our secret superpower. So that is something, we are sort of a fundamentally dependent, right? There should not be a declaration of independence, but a declaration of dependency, right? That is the secret, that is central to what it means to being human. So I think that is the model of human nature that we need to build everything on, our institutions, how we do politics, because sort of what we see in other people is often what we get out of them. If we assume that most people are selfish, then we're going to design our schools and our workplaces and our prisons and our politics in a way, that will bring out the worst in people. If you turn it around and if you actually assume the best in other people, I think you can create a totally different world.
Do you think we're moving towards such a world where we can actually start to think the best of other people? The whole idea of working from home, it's taken corporates a long time to get to the point where they trust their workforce.
Yeah,
Great point. Because the first reaction is that everybody's busy slacking off. Or even the idea of a certain social security that is a must. I think that's one of the big lessons of the pandemic. Do you think the pandemic is a moment in our history which will change us fundamentally?
Maybe. So, as I said, crises are shifting points for societies, and it's relatively easy to imagine a dark path that lies ahead. We know that crises have been abused by those in power, through the ages. If you look at the 1930s, Germany, you had the burning of the Reichstag and then the ascent of Adolf Hitler to power. Right. Think about the effect of 9/11. Right. A great tragedy, and it was abused by those in power to start 2 illegal wars. So, as I said, it's easy to imagine something like that happening again. But there are also signs in the other direction, actually more hopeful signs. What we've seen in just the past 10 years is that ideas that really used to be dismissed as highly unrealistic, that was never gonna work out, totally impossible, have actually moved into the mainstream. I'm really not an expert on Indian politics, so you'll have to tell me about that. But this is what I see from my Western perspective, or my Dutch perspective, is that, quite a lot has actually changed. That makes me hopeful. That makes me hopeful for the future. There's still a long way to go.
Sorry, do you mean the ideas of climate change, despite the climate deniers? Now there is an acceptance that, yes, it exists. I mean, it's staring you in the face.
Yes, that's just one of the examples, yeah.
Or of universal healthcare. The pandemic has taught us the greatest nations in the world don't necessarily have the best healthcare.
Yeah.
What are some of the other lessons which you think the world has learned the hard way?
Well, I think if you look at, how we talk about racism today, how many George Floyds have there been before George Floyd? Right. That didn't cause this massive protest. I think the latest estimate is that around 18 to 25 million people have participated in those protests. It's the biggest protest in the history of the United States. It's absolutely amazing. Right. What we're going through here, and it has had global effects. It has a really big effect in the Netherlands here as well, on discussions about racism. Our prime minister, for the first time, really seemed to recognize the issue, and that's because something that happened thousands of kilometers away. So things like that give me hope.
What about the Me Too movement? The idea of pushback against misogyny.
Another great example.
Yeah.
So, one of the ironical things about progress is that when progress happens, it actually often feels like the opposite.
Yeah.
So let me give you one example. Tax evasion. 10 years ago, there was hardly any discussion of this whole phenomenon where rich people have their armies of lawyers and accountants with their, meaningless jobs, who basically try to make sure that these rich people pay as little in tax as possible. They stash it on the Bermuda Islands or in a tax paradise like the Netherlands, where I'm from. And there was hardly any discussion about that. There was no controversy. Now that's very different. So now, you know, you can go viral with a video about taxes, right? That can happen now. And many people think, because it's much more in the news nowadays and there's much more outrage about it, that it's worse than 10 years ago. But it's actually getting better, exactly because we're angry about it. So this is another paradox of my book, is that even though we've evolved to be friendly, progress often starts with unfriendly people who are willing to go against the status quo, who are willing to, you know, make other people uncomfortable and to change something, right? I think that is, you know, what you really have to do if you want to make progress at some point.
Yeah,
I mean, you have to do the uncomfortable thing.
And no revolution comes out of kindness; it comes out of anger usually.
Yeah. So it's sort of a combination. That's why I like sort of the summary of, remember that most people are pretty decent.
Yeah.
But also remember that power corrupts.
Yes.
So be tough on those in power, but be kind and warm to people, right? Or be hard on systems, but always remember what you're doing it for. Sort of what the, you know, where we're meant to go. Our utopia is a world of friendliness and kindness and cooperation, where people can follow their dreams and realize their ambitions. That's the end goal.
Is one of the lessons of the pandemic, which unfortunately people might learn, is that globalization has not been good for us. That really, you know, if we didn't live in such an interconnected world, the virus wouldn't have spread as quickly and as far as it did. Is that one of the things that could be an outcome? Are we going to become more protectionist?
Maybe, I don't know. You know, I'm skeptical of the sort of the standard anti-globalization arguments.
Yeah.
You know, as a historian, I know that, you know, the plague spread without air travel, and the plague spread without, you know, all the modern technologies that we have. But
not as quickly.
Not as quickly.
Yeah.
The viruses are still going to spread. You know, that's something we'll have to deal with. Right. And actually, knowledge and ideas also spread much faster now. I mean, there are more than 100 vaccines in development. And so I think that on average, global cooperation is a really good thing. The problem, though, when we talk about globalization, it has often been this Davos-style globalization, right? Globalization for elites. So the very rich people can travel around the globe in their private jets. But actually, most people, they're stuck in their own countries, right? So we have globalization for algorithms. We have globalization for bananas who can travel the globe. But we often don't have globalization for people. Then we suddenly say, oh, it's a migrant crisis, right? And they're coming to steal our jobs, etc.
Yeah, right.
And I think there's actually a very powerful argument to be made that we should have proper, real globalization, and end this system of global apartheid that we have now, where we basically treat refugees like scum so often. So I don't know, when people say globalization, I'm saying, well, wouldn't that be a good idea?
Yeah. That's like Gandhi, who said, who was asked about Western civilization, and he said it's a good idea. In fact, you mentioned Gandhi as well, and you talk in more detail about Mandela. And that really for us is when kindness triumphs, when an idea like non-violence in what is inherently a violent world, when that succeeds. But you also talk about the idea of when the other is in close proximity with each other, and you talk about it with Nelson Mandela and the Afrikaner leader. Talk a little about this idea, because we feel very happy that this is one of the global ideas that India has contributed to the world.
Yes. You know, what's so fascinating is that these ideas developed by people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and later Mandela, is that back then it was still a theory, right? A powerful theory about how you can change the world with nonviolent resistance.
Right.
They believe that if you just have the moral high ground and you're basically moral superior to your enemy, then you'll prevail in the long run. What's so interesting is that now we have actually really powerful empirical scientific evidence that shows they were right. So there's a sociologist called Erica Chenoweth who's built a big database of resistance movements since the year 1900. And what she's shown is that actually peaceful resistance movements are more effective, twice as effective as violent resistance movements. So peace is more effective than violence. I think that's really interesting. It's more realistic. So it's not naive to turn the other cheek. No, it's realistic. It's actually an effective way of changing the world. And why is that the case? Well, because it draws in a lot more people. That's the main reason. So on average, 11 times more people participate in peaceful resistance movements than in violent resistance movements. And that's exactly what happened with the George Floyd protests.
Right.
Why were they so big? Because they were overwhelmingly peaceful. And that's why they've had such an incredible influence already around the globe. And I think it's just the beginning. So that is an old lesson that we've learned from people like Gandhi and Mandela and Martin Luther King, and it still applies today.
I wonder too what kind of impact that will have on the US elections, because that is something that I really cannot fathom. That could they possibly re-elect Trump despite this outrage against his handling of race relations, of women in general?
Well, you have to recognize here that the United States is not a proper democracy anymore. It simply isn't. So Trump already, well, sort of the most positive way we would say is that it's an elective aristocracy. So people are allowed to choose their own aristocrats from certain dynasties. So you have the Bushes and you have the Clintons and you have the Obamas, etc., and you can choose politicians from those dynasties, which is already, I mean, from
Trumps. I hope there are no Trumps.
Well, from a European perspective, that is already pretty crazy. The whole notion that the wife of our prime minister, he doesn't have a wife, by the way, but the whole notion that if he would have one, or a husband, that person would, sort of succeed him. I mean, that's ridiculous. In a democracy, you don't work with dynasties. You have a proper democracy is very different. So then the other issue is obviously that Clinton had 3 million more votes than Trump in 2016, but she still lost the elections. And now we see the attack on the post office. We see voter suppression.
Yeah.
So that is the big difficulty. Again, democracy, wouldn't that be a great idea? I'm very much in favor of that. But what we have nowadays are highly problematic elective aristocracies. It's better than nothing. I mean, it's better than a full autocracy or a dictatorship. But let's not delude ourselves. It's simply not true that the people are in charge. I think it would be a great idea if we would have that. And in the book, I have a chapter about what a real democracy would look like, where you would have participatory citizens' assemblies, and you would use the tool of sortition to randomly select politicians from the population. So that a lot of people would become a politician during their lifetime, or at least almost everyone would know a politician. I think that is a much saner method of doing democracy, and it's actually the original idea as well. So if you go look at the history of democracy and you look how the Greeks did it, 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, that was the model. Not elections, not choosing your own aristocrats, but becoming a politician yourself. Right.
And perhaps the whole idea of citizen movements is in a way progressing towards that idea. But when you talk about elected dynasts, let me tell you, we have a lot of that in India as well. We veer between elected dynasts and elected autocrats. So we, that's the way our democracy.
Yes. And that is what's so worrisome, because, I mean, Trump is clearly quite incompetent.
Yes.
But just imagine someone with the determination of an Adolf Hitler in the current political environment in the US. Now that is what scares me.
Yeah.
Because, the institutions have become so weak, and the polarization has become so intense that I think someone like a Hitler, like a proper dictator, really with the intention of grabbing all the power. I mean, Trump seems quite lazy as well. He's not interested in many things. He's just only interested in himself, right? He's the clear example of a narcissist.
Absolutely.
But just imagine someone who's really has this pathological tendencies, who wants to be all powerful. And then in a system like the US is right now, I mean, that is what really scares me.
Right. So China doesn't scare you. The US scares you more. In
Oh,
terms
no,
of
no,
their
no, no, no.
culture.
I'm not in the process of comparing. And it's not automatically that, the enemy of your enemy is your friend.
Is your
I'm not
friend.
that kind
That's
of
a
thinker.
very George
Yeah.
Bush kind of.
Yeah, exactly. This is one of the strange things about being an international author, is that what often happens is that you're being interviewed about this or that, and then soon questions start popping up about, yeah, but what about the political system of Korea? What do you think they're doing in Japan? And I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. And I just have to be wary that I don't become too much of a narcissist to actually start answering those questions.
No, and also I think there's so much diversity in political systems all around the world. It's so difficult to keep tabs on what's happening everywhere.
Yes.
But I love the 10 rules that you have to live by. Which one of them is avoid the news, which I love. Don't punch the Nazis. Explain don't punch the Nazis for our viewers. I love that.
Well, I think there's a certain kind of activism, and this is something that I learned from one of my favorite authors, Rebecca Solnit.
Yeah.
She taught me that there's a certain kind of activism that cares more about being right or being pure, being on the right side of history, than actually winning.
Yeah.
And I think this is often what happens with sort of Antifa, for example, activists who like to punch Nazis. And they don't really ask themselves the question, is this actually effective? Do you actually change the world with something like that? And I think there's a powerful argument to be made that it's actually counterproductive. Because just as if you want to have more terrorism, you've got to start bombing the Middle East, because that's the perfect way for them to recruit more terrorists, right? That's sort of how it works. Yeah. So it's very counterproductive to do that. But that's also true for punching Nazis, hugging Nazis. They hate that. They don't want to be hugged. That's sort of their nightmare scenario. So if you do that, it may actually be much more powerful. But that takes real courage as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that you have to be naive or anything, right? You have to be very realistic about the corruptive effects of power and about, power differences in this world. But in the book, I give a couple of case studies of institutions or organizations that really use this turn the other cheek approach with terrific success. I have one chapter about the criminal justice system in Norway, which is really strange. But what they do there is they treat prisoners with an extraordinary amount of kindness. Right. Prisoners get the freedom to socialize with the guards, to make their own music. They've got their own music studio and their own music label, which is called Criminal Records. And at first you think, this is crazy. They've gone nuts, these prisoners in holiday resorts. But then you look at the results, at the recidivism rate, for example, the chance that someone will commit another crime once he or she gets out of prison. And then you discover that Norway has the most effective prisons in the world. So I think you can learn a lot from the state of civilization of a country by just visiting the prisons and just looking at that.
Right.
And also looking at how people treat animals, by the way. I think that's something Gandhi said as well.
Absolutely. So I just want to read out the 10 rules to live by for our viewers. One is, when in doubt, assume the best. Think in win-win scenarios, which you've already talked about. Ask more questions. I think that's, again, interesting. Ask more questions to those in power, to those in authority.
But also of those close to you.
Yeah.
Very often we assume that we know what the other people around us are thinking. Right. So we've all heard about the golden rule that is, there in so many of the world's religions, sort of treat other people as you would like to be treated.
Yeah.
And I think that's a powerful rule. It's not perfect though. Right. We also have the platinum rule, which is, well, maybe ask that other person first what he or she wants, because the preferences might be different. Asking questions is something that we don't do enough, including myself. I mean, I've written these rules for life mainly for myself, and I don't have the illusion that self-help books will change the world.
Yeah, you
It's
said
most
that.
important to change our institutions.
Yeah.
And once we build institutions that are grounded in a different view of human nature, I think that's where real change starts. But I simply couldn't resist, because there are also personal implications. If you have a new, more realistic view of who we are as a species, you'll just see that you'll start living your life in a different way.
When you talk about institutions, that's one of the issues, that that a lot of our shameless leaders would actually be quite happy if we privatized our lives. There's a whole lot of talk currently in India about self-reliance, which essentially means that, earlier it was living in gated communities with your own water, your own electricity, your own healthcare. Now it's literally every household for itself. You take care of your education, your health, your employment. Forget about asking the government for anything. That's one of the dangers when you're faced with shameless leaders, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There was this saying in the US, don't ask your government what can do for you, but ask what you can do for your government.
Yeah.
I mean, and that sounds all very nice, but I think we're now at a point where we actually should ask our governments, what are you going to do for us?
Exactly.
Because we're paying a lot in taxes, and we're working very hard, and what are we getting in return?
Yeah.
I think that's an entirely legitimate question.
Absolutely.
And if you see and you look at the effect of the pandemic around the globe, you really see that the governments, who are properly financed and accountable to the people, they perform much better.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's really important to push against those things, because they sort of want to play divide and conquer.
Right.
And when elites get nervous, it's when people come together, that's when they get nervous. It's an act of defiance, I believe, to assume the best in other people. It's really an act of defiance, because remember, cynicism is a legitimization of hierarchy. Cynicism is a tool of those in power, because then they can say, look, you need us.
Yeah.
You need the CEOs and the princes and the monarchs and the presidents, etc. You can't do without us because you don't trust each other.
Right.
Now, if you do actually start trust each other, if you look one another in the eye, if you see each other blush and you start working together, then they get really, really nervous.
I'll just quickly go over some of the other rules. I know you said that it's not a self-help book, but it really does help, And the fourth rule is temper your empathy, train your compassion. Talk a little about this as well.
Yes. Well, empathy is an interesting thing. I think most people see empathy as a good thing, and that we need more empathy in the world. But psychologists actually make a really good point that empathy is quite limited. Empathy is a little bit like a spotlight or a searchlight. There's a great book by an American psychologist called Paul Bloom with the title Against Empathy. Don't you love that? He's against empathy. And actually, he makes the case very well, I think, because it's so limited. We mainly focus on our own bubble, on our own circle of friends, on those who are already part of our own group. And then we feel a lot of empathy for them. After a terrorist attack, for example, we feel so much empathy for the victim. And then what happens after that is that we want vengeance. We don't zoom out anymore. We don't clearly see what's going on the other side anymore. And then we end up in these cycles of violence, We get stuck in these nasty dynamics. So what I think we need is not so much empathy, but compassion. And compassion helps people to zoom out, to take a little bit more of a rational approach, to really feel for other people. You see their distress and you want to help them, but you don't get swept away by it, right? You don't lose yourself in the process. And what's so interesting is that neurologists have actually discovered that empathy and compassion are two different things in the brain.
Right.
You really see different regions of the brain light up when people have feelings of empathy versus compassion. Right. And it's something you can train. So meditation is one way to train it. Now, I tried that. I'm terrible at meditation, but maybe it's for other people. But it's also something just to think about, to develop, is that it's not always a good thing to follow your intuition. Sometimes your intuition can really lead you astray. And what you actually need is a bit more distance and a bit more, compassion.
Number 5 is try to understand the other, even if you don't get where they're coming from. 6 is love your own as others love their own. 7 is avoid the news. 8, we've discussed, don't punch the Nazis. 9, come out of the closet, don't be ashamed to do good, which is lovely. and
Yeah.
10 is be realistic. And I think when
Yeah.
you're saying be realistic, you're saying that also understand that people can be kind to each other rather than
Yeah.
unkind to each other.
Yeah. And be prepared that you'll often be dismissed as unrealistic, as naive, as stupid, and that people will not take you seriously.
Right.
But then remember then that what's unrealistic today may actually be realistic tomorrow. That's how progress works. That's how change works. And we've seen it happening so many times. In my previous book, Utopia for Realists, that I was really fascinated by that, how ideas that used to be completely utopian can become reality. Whether you talk about the end.
Slavery, you talk,
Yeah, exactly. We've had slavery for thousands of years in the so-called civilized world. And slavery still exists, but officially it's banned in every country in the world. So that is incredible progress that at the beginning of the 17th or 18th century, you wouldn't have predicted that. So progress is real, it exists.
But equality for men and women again.
Exactly. Yeah, there are many examples.
Yeah.
And this doesn't happen automatically. So don't be an optimist, because optimism is often a form of complacency, where especially privileged people say, I'm an optimist, things will turn out to be all right. Well, many people don't have that luxury to be an optimist, but you can have hope. And that's what I like about hope. Hope impels you to act. It makes you see the world in a clear way. You don't become naive, but you have hope because you look around you and you realize that if people work together, they can achieve extraordinary things.
Just a last question, Rutger. I was very curious. How did your life change after the episode in Davos? Did it?
Well, not much, I hit my 15 seconds of fame, and that was interesting. But, you can go on a whole speaking circuit tour and, give the same 10-minute talk all over again and get rich quickly. But that's not really my cup of tea. So I'm just a writer of books. And I had the extraordinary privilege, to be working on this book for 6 years. Right. And really try and understand what the latest science is on who we are as a species. So I guess now I have to think about a new one.
Or perhaps go on a speaking tour, at least a virtual speaking tour for this one first, and then think of writing the other one.
Well, I'm doing everything online, it's all Zoom these days.
Thank you so much for your time, Rutger. It was really a pleasure talking to you. And maybe hold up the book once again for our viewers, and I hope they get to read it. It's quite entertaining, actually, not just enlightening. Thank you.
Thanks.